What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Wood Hacks. How many of you have ever said to yourself, today's the day I'm gonna understand formulas? With your nerd dial cranked up to max, you jump into the formula editor and see this. Next thing you know, you're saying to yourself, tomorrow's the day I'm gonna understand formulas. I know that's how things were for me the first time I tried my hand at Microvellum formulas, which, to be honest, are just Excel formulas on steroids or crack. But I knew for me that if I was going to make Microvellum do all the cool stuff the pros on the forums were saying it could do, I was gonna have to learn formula reading and writing. At first, formulas looked foreign to me, but after a little while, I began to see them like this. And not long after that, I was able to read them like this. I promise that you too can get to this point. So, to help get you on your way to becoming a formula reading writing pro, I'm going to go over the top 4 functions that every Microvellum user should know. And since we'll be learning about functions, I thought it'd be fun to do this whole episode in another segment of Fun with Functions. The first function we're going to learn is the if function. This function is without a doubt the most widely used function throughout Microvellum. It's important to understand the basic structure of this function. Every if statement consists of 3 arguments. That's it. Yes, really. Typed out, an if statement will look like this. So, the first argument you need is a logical test. Is this true or is this false? Or, as you'll see often in Microvellum, does this equal 1 or 0? The second argument is the value you want to return if the logical test is true. And the third argument you need is the value you want to return if the logical test is false. An easy way to read if statements is, if this is true, then return this. Otherwise, return that. So, if, then, otherwise. With all functions, the entire if statement is contained in parentheses, and each argument is separated by a comma. A cool thing you'll see, and this happens throughout Microvellum, is that each argument can contain other functions and formulas. But at the end of the day, if statements still only consist of 3 arguments. All right, let's check out the and or functions. And or functions contain groups of logical tests. In an and statement, the logical tests are being checked to see if they are all true or not. An and statement will return a false value if any of the logical tests are false. So, in order for an and statement to return a true value, all of the logical tests must be true. The or function works similarly to the and function, with the exception that only one logical test has to be true in order to return a true value. And or functions are used very frequently within if statements. An if and statement would look like this. The and function is being used to determine the main logical test for this if statement. So, if logical test 1 is true and logical test 2 is true, then return this value, otherwise return that value. An if or statement would look like this. If logical test 1 is true or logical test true is true, then return this value, otherwise return that value. So just to recap, with and statements, all logical tests must be true in order to return a true value. And with or statements, only one logical test has to be true. Okay, now on to the really fun one, VLOOKUP. VLOOKUPs are used to search a range of cells or a table and return a value based on certain criteria. There are 4 arguments or parameters that make up a VLOOKUP function: value, range, column number, and logical value. The value is the criteria to be searched in the leftmost column of the range. The range is the reference of a group of cells or a table that will be searched. The column number will designate what column from left to right we want to return the value from. The logical value, true or false, will determine whether you are using an exact value lookup or an approximate value lookup. Best way to describe how this works is just to show you. In this first example, we're going to use the VLOOKUP to return the slide name based on the slide length. For the formula, the value or criteria to search is the slide length, which is 16. The range we are looking in is lookup table drawer slide. We're wanting to return a value from column 5, which is the drawer slide name. Then, because we're referencing an exact match value based on the last parameter being false, it's going to return drawer slide 16. In the next example, we're going to return a value based on an approximate value approach. This formula is referencing the cabinet depth, which is 19.25 inches in this case. 19.25 doesn't exist in the range of values in the first column. 19.25 is greater than 18, so naturally the formula would look down to the next row. But because we're using an approximate value set by using true, the formula will look up a row, which turns out to be the row for the 18-inch drawer slide. So a quick tip for reading or writing a VLOOKUP function is first to determine if it's an exact or approximate value reference. Exact will be false, meaning it won't look up, whereas approximate will be true, meaning it will look up to the next row. With that being said, we'll go ahead and conclude today's segment of Fun with Functions. Alrighty, so there you have it, the top 4 functions every Microvellum user should know and understand to get started. If, and, or, and VLOOKUP. If this video didn't quite do it for you, one of the best things about Microvellum using Excel-based functions is that you can find all sorts of resources online to help you understand them. And you can always go ask the gurus on the community forums. That's gonna do it for this episode of Wood Hacks. Stay cool and stay sharp, and I'll see you next time. Whoa, what's that? Index match? Oh, heck yeah. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Wood Hacks. How many of you then, because we're referencing an exact match based then because we're referencing So a quick tip for reading and writing a With that being said, we'll go ahead and conclude. Let it refresh its little brain.